reitero personalment la benvinguda en aquesta nova sessió del cicle organitzat com cada any amb l'Institut Europeu de la Mediterrània, que com veuran complementa molt bé la sessió que vàrem tenir dimecres passat, el passat dia 5 de novembre, i ens dona una visió més àmplia de com, d'un repte tan difícil i tan apassionant alhora, de com restaurar l'equilibri ecològic a la Mediterrània. Comentàvem l'altre dia, i és un fet obvi i una banalitat dir-ho, i comentàvem que al llarg dels segles la Mediterrània, i de manera més intensificada, diguem-ne, els darrers decennis, ha viscut tota mena d'amenaces, de perills, de riscos, d'atacs, de violacions, entre cometes, i que mantenir un bon equilibri ecològic cada cop és més difícil i una tasca realment ímproba. Avui ens parlarà el senyor Giuseppe di Carlo d'aquesta... Està ben pronunciat, m'imagino, Giuseppe di Carlo. Sí. És correcte? És correcte?
The way he's pronouncing your name.
Yes. Molt bé. Perquè els catalans tenim una certa simpatia per la llengua italiana. Una de les coses pendents que tenim molts catalans és tenir... Ens encantaria arribar a parlar algun dia bé l'italià. Però bueno, no desesperem, potser hi arribarem algun dia. En tot cas, moltes gràcies per ser aquí amb nosaltres, perquè ens parlarà d'aquest tema, de com restaurar l'equilibri ecològic a la Mediterrània i posarà l'accent en quin paper pot jugar l'acció col·lectiva, quin paper la comunitat, tots nosaltres, tots els ciutadans, en definitiva, amb diferents rols que ens pertoquen, podem jugar per contribuir a restaurar aquest equilibri que, insisteixo, és una tasca no gens fàcil ni bé donada, que requereix constància, enginy, compromís i persistència. En tot cas, moltes gràcies al ponent per els seus ensenyaments d'avui i gràcies de nou un cop més a la moderadora, que cada cop ens és més familiar. Naturalment, ja agraïm molt la seva feina i el seu interès. Moltes gràcies.
Hola, benvinguts. Passaré a anglès. Sí, I've been looking at my phone, but it's only because the questions are here. Please don't think I'm being rude. We are so lucky to have our speaker with us today. As we've been exploring in the previous conversations, the Mediterranean is quite the exceptional sea. While representing kind of only 1%, it has an oversized influence in many ways in terms of the role that it plays in biodiversity. It's culturally also incredibly mixed, but it's also a victim of a lot of different pressures. So we've talked about plastics in previous conversations, about pollution, about uncontrolled urban development. And today we're here to discuss what is the shift of paradigm that we need to make the Mediterranean go from like an ocean a sea under siege from all these threats to a sea that is thriving. And we cannot continue doing business as usual. This requires a lot of thought, and I'm very grateful to have here with us an expert, somebody who spent more than 15 years working at this, trying to figure out how to bring together these complex frameworks of collaboration across different actors so that we can effectively heal and find ways to regenerate our oceans. So I will read his bio shortly because he has actually been in leadership in like many different organizations. But Giuseppe di Carlo, he's a scientist, an expert, and he has had leadership roles in NGOs like WWF, Palau, Bertarelli, Ocean Legacy, the Mediterranean Marine Initiative. And yeah, his work really spans a lot of different subjects, from sustainable fisheries to marine protected areas. And before we dive into all these kind of practical restoration options, I would love to start with why before we go into the how. What brought you into this line of work? Why did you decide to dedicate yourself to the ocean?
Thank you, and good evening, everybody. It's really a pleasure for me to be here. Thank you for the invite. I often talk to very technical audiences, so for me it's a pleasure to be able to speak more freely with people that want to understand the challenges of the Mediterranean. And I should probably start with the caveat. I can only share my experience. I don't have silver bullets or solutions to very complex problems, which I think most of you know, but I'm certainly happy to share a little bit of my story and my journey. The why is very simple in the sense that I feel I almost had no choice. I was born on the sea in the city of Palermo in Sicily, which has a lot of, speaking about language, actually, a lot of similarities in the language. And my family spent most of our time at the sea. And so when I was about 14, I had the opportunity to start diving. And that was a quick shift from wanting to be a veterinarian to understanding the beauty of the ocean, of the sea. And I think it's just a connection, right, that a lot of people have with the ocean. We feel that we have a deep connection, a deep understanding of the ocean and everything the ocean feels. And so I turned what I thought it was a passion, in some ways I thought it was a calling into my career. And there have been moments that I obviously wanted to quit. I think that's obvious. That's obviously given in any career, but this is a particularly frustrating line of work. Yeah. So there have been times that I wanted to quit, but there have also times that I've seen the change that we can generate. So that has always given me energy and hope to continue.
I can definitely relate. I'm wondering, you've been at this for a long time. Were there any moments where you witnessed any pivots, any tipping points, or you witnessed firsthand something in the Mediterranean in terms of degradation that you were like, no, this is it. Now I am. There was already a passion, but were there any moments where you're like, I must commit myself to this because you...
Well, I mean, we probably have had the last 20 years, which have been the 20 years I more or less have been in this job. We've had perhaps the biggest realization of the change. We didn't create the change in the last 20 years, but I think we're starting to see the change that we have created over the last 50 plus years. And I think there have been a number of times, including times where we're starting to see alien species coming into the Mediterranean and diving on the coast of Turkey or Greece, and you see that there is basically nothing left. I mean, there is the rabbit fish, which is a fish that has come through the Suez Canal, has really destroyed the ecosystem. But we should also say that that ecosystem was already particularly degraded. So in some ways, the conditions were already there for failure, certainly not for success. And then over time, we have seen species that we thought were extinct. I mean, the angel shark, which is a very vulnerable and very incredible species of shark that we have in the Mediterranean, was thought to be extinct. And then a few years back, he popped back up and he was fished in Croatia. And, a fish that we thought was extinct is actually still there. And now we have a number of sightings of angel sharks in the Mediterranean. So we have seen moments of sort of peaks, negative peaks, and probably moments of positive peaks. An example that probably a lot of people know and that I think is also probably dear to Spanish people is the bluefin tuna. Yeah. In the mid-90s, the bluefin tuna, which is a fish that we all grew up eating. I mean, my family, I spent most of my summers on an island that had a tuna fishing community. And when I was a kid, we used to buy an entire tuna from the fishermen, and then we would eat that tuna over the year. Over the last 10, 15 years, I don't think that many people have eaten bluefin tuna anymore. First, because there wasn't much, and second is because the one that there is packed and shipped to Japan because it's much more profitable. So in the mid-90s, we realized that the bluefin tuna was about to disappear. The population was so low that there were serious concerns that we wouldn't be able to fish it anymore. But with times and with regulations and with seriousness and with control, in the last 5 years, the bluefin tuna has actually come back to the pre-90s levels. And so now we can go back and eat bluefin tuna at a restaurant, which is a fish that, again, for the last 10 years, we didn't have access to anymore. And then there was a similar fate with the swordfish, another fish that is really important on our table. I think the swordfish in some ways paid the price of the bluefin tuna, because a lot of the fishers were around the Mediterranean were fishing bluefin. As you know, the bluefin comes through the Strait of Gibraltar from the Atlantic Ocean into the Mediterranean to reproduce. And one of the two areas where it reproduces are the Balearic Islands, and the others is off the Gulf of Libya. And so we used to fish the bluefin tuna from where it entered the Mediterranean all the way to Libya and in its way back to the Atlantic. I lost my train of thought, actually. Yes, but at some point, people couldn't fish the bluefin tuna anymore, and so they started increasing pressure on the swordfish. But again, in recent times, a swordfish recovery plan was put in place, which seems to be doing well. And so I think in the next few years, we'll have a healthy bluefin tuna population and a healthy swordfish population. That, I think, brings me, I don't want to get too ahead of myself, but I think that gets a bit to a point of the impact of consumers. When there was the work on the bluefin tuna, I was on the front lines with WWF and others. We try to influence consumers. We try to influence restaurants not to buy bluefin tuna anymore. And one of the countries we worked with was Monaco, with the Principality of Monaco. They've been behind the recovery of the bluefin tuna for quite some time. And so there was a whole act of talking to consumers and talking to restaurants about not actively put bluefin tuna on the menu, because the population at that time was so low. And then in recent years, we went back and said, well, put back the bluefin tuna on the menu, because now it's actually not only a healthy choice, but a sustainable choice.
Incredible. I think this brings me to a question about systematic approaches, because when we think about conservation, sometimes we think about very specific things, but you take a really systematic approach to this regeneration. I guess maybe a good place to start is, what is a regenerative approach? Like, how is it different to talk about restoration and regeneration than it is the conventional kind of protection thinking that we had in the environmental world before? What are the differences?
Yeah, I'll try to perhaps be brief and keep it simple, because we tend to get lost into the jargon that we use all the time. I wanted to say that I studied marine science, and I didn't know that I would get into a job where I actually have to pay attention to much more complex problems. In a sense that we live in a region that is complex geopolitically. The dynamics between countries or between states play an important role, because in the end, the Mediterranean is a shared space, and most of the resources are shared. And so if countries do not get along, it's very difficult to bring them to the table to find solutions. So that's one thing that's important. So we have to see the whole picture, right? We have to see the complexity. We have to see the interactions among sectors. Of course, we now, for example, talk quite a bit about sustainable and renewable energies, including offshore wind, which happens in the sea. And that slide was supposed to be at the end. But we also have to unpack and think about solutions into specific fields. Now, I think over the last 10 years, we went from thinking that we had to protect the ocean, or nature more broadly, to the idea that we have degraded nature so much that we actually have to restore it. And so, for example, since we sit in a European country, Europe passed what's called the Nature Restoration Law. The Nature Restoration Law intends to restore nature in Europe by 90% by 2050, which is a pretty challenging target, if you ask me. So when we bring this to the sea, a simple example is, again, with fish, but we can also talk about seagrass, the seagrass that we all see when we go swimming. For a long time, we've seen the seagrass degrading to a point. This is the seagrass here in the picture. So, mostly because of pollution, because of coastal infrastructure, because of leisure boating. So unfortunately, the seagrass has disappeared by 20-30% to what it was a long time ago, probably mid 70s levels. And we hadn't found a way to be able to restore it because the species was complex, and it wasn't easy to cut the piece and plant it, just like we do, for example, with mangroves, which have a history of being transplanted in many parts of the world and with success. So regenerating the ocean means trying to find solutions that help bring some of nature back. An example, again, is with fisheries. In the 1980s, about 90% of the fish that we eat that comes from the Mediterranean was overfished. And Spain actually has a high consumption of fish per capita, one of the highest with Portugal in Europe. But unfortunately, most of the fish we were eating in the 1980s and 1990s was mostly overfished. And then it came the realization that things were really going south, and fishers were literally losing their jobs and their livelihoods. Ultimately, the change came from them. I mean, they wanted to start finding options because they realized very quickly that weren't able to sustain their lives, and they wanted to continue to do fishing. This was in their tradition, in their history, in their culture. Today, I was at a fisheries meeting last week, and we have reduced our overfishing to about 50%. So today, 50% of the fish that comes from the Mediterranean is overfished, which is still very negative if you want to see the glass half empty. But in some ways, it is very positive because we've been trying slowly to create that change. That change comes at a very slow pace compared to the damage that we do. It's always faster to destroy than it is to rebuild. Unfortunately, that applies to nature as well. Nature does recover. We have seen that recovery. We talked about the bluefin as an example. But at the same time, we have to understand that happens in decades. And so when we're in a situation like overfishing, it will take 20 years to restore the balance of fish in the ocean. If we talk about sharks, for example, which is another really interesting example, and people often don't think about sharks because we have this thinking, this myth, the sharks are dangerous. But actually, sharks are really important for the balance in the ecosystem. They're at the top of the trophic chain, and they have an important role in the ecosystem. But unfortunately, again, about 50%, we have about 80 species of shark and rays in the Mediterranean. About 50% of them are already in serious danger. Some of it from fishing, for example, because we do eat sharks, even if we often don't know.
Yeah, very few people know that.
Exactly.
This leads me, you've discussed a few different challenges, which leads me to the question, given that we are tackling, pollution and overfishing and ocean warming and acidification, all these things colliding, how do you help the folks you consult for, and Bertarelli Foundation and many others, how do you help them prioritize, and how do you decide what are the issues worth pushing for with most urgency or that have the biggest chance of a positive result? How do you, because I'm sure there must be so many.
It's a mix of elements. Some of them are my own interest and my own passion and what I think perhaps it should be done. The Mediterranean is a very healthy ecosystems of NGOs and institutions compared to when you work in other parts of the world. So in some ways, we're fortunate because we have good science, good academics, good NGOs, and good political and institutional infrastructure. So there's really a lot that is done in the Mediterranean, certainly more in Europe, but in the Mediterranean to be able to address some of the challenges. Again, unfortunately, we don't do it at a pace that generates, I think, the change that we want to see, particularly in our own lifetime. There are things that we'll have to come to terms with. Some things might change for the positive, but we won't be able to see it in our own lifetime. What I try to do is try to understand, for example, what is the landscape of issues. It's hard to tackle everything. It's hard to do everything at the same time. And I try to focus on where I can bring added value. Second, where I can bring people together to bring that added value. And so, for example, if you think about Mediterranean marine parks or MPAs, the Balearic Island is an MPA, for example. There are many more. Actually, Spain has been certainly a champion in protecting its coastline in recent times. So it's also been one of the countries that ratified the High Sea Treaty more recently. We can talk about that if you like. But most of the marine protected areas that we have are very small and very coastal. And so often they're able to provide benefits in a very small area. If you compare that to the sea, it's like protecting a little piece of the forest compared to protecting the whole of the forest.
Yeah.
We all understand that protecting the whole of the forest generates more benefits for nature, it generates more benefit for people. There are more animals, animals can move freely between protected areas. And so the challenge is that when we have all those little marine protected areas in several places of the Mediterranean, the overall benefit isn't sufficient to be able to generate the resources that we need. And so one of the things I've been thinking about is how do we protect larger pieces of the ocean, which comes, of course, with its own complexity, because the Mediterranean is very small and very busy. And so everywhere you put the finger on the map, there is probably something.
Yeah.
You know, there is either an offshore wind farm, aquaculture, maritime traffic. As you probably know, the Mediterranean is one of the highest traffic, shipping traffic in the world, because, you know, boats and vessels go through the Gibraltar, through the Suez Canal to get to the other parts of the world. So it's very busy and very difficult to find places where there is not a diversity of activities.
Yeah.
And so when we do this work, we start analyzing what is there that can be moved, because sometimes things cannot be moved.
Yeah.
What is there that we can live with? So sometimes certain impacts can be mitigated or can be acceptable. It's very difficult to protect large parts of the ocean by removing everything and leaving those parts intact. I mean, that's the dream. But ultimately, we have to come to terms with the politics and the economics. And so when you sit at the table with decision maker and they have the ears of the fishers, for example, or the ear of the developers, or the ear of the tourism industry, which is obviously in the Mediterranean, is perhaps the biggest economic driver.
In Spain in particular.
Spain, I mean, Croatia, I think 30% of its GDP comes from tourism. Malta, I mean, you have a number of countries. So you have to come to a compromise. And sometimes coming to that compromise is difficult because we want the best outcome for the ocean. So for me, protecting large parts of the ocean and trying to find the right balance between economic development and marine conservation is that line I try to walk on.
Yeah.
But it's easier said than done.
It's always a trade-off, I imagine.
Yeah.
But it's the most important job, and I wonder if there's any issue that you think is kind of overlooked, especially I'm sure we're all aware of a lot of them, like plastics that have been in the mainstream media recently. Are there any issues in the Mediterranean specifically that you think are not getting the attention that they deserve, or anyone?
Yeah, let me mention plastics and then come to a couple of things that are overlooked. Plastics actually not overlooked because it's something that we can all see, we can all understand. And so plastic resonates very well with people compared to fishing, right, or other things. And so the Mediterranean certainly has a lot of plastics. I think there is a number, we worked on a report some years back with WWF where we estimated there is about 33,000 bottles going into the sea every minute, just to give you a sense. And I believe, not to name and shame, but I think Turkey has one of the highest plastic pollution coming into the ocean than other countries. So plastic is important, but I feel that's something that people understand, that can contribute to. And Europe has put in place some regulations. The two things that I would mention are, again, one is sharks, because people don't understand the importance of sharks for the ecosystems. They don't have affinity for sharks like we have for seals or turtles or
dolphins.
yeah, exactly, whales. Sharks are, less loved if you want, but they're still very important, and I think they're often overlooked. And there are some pictures that I don't have with me, but there are some pretty sad pictures of sharks being fished in certain places. 2 years ago, if I remember correctly, but anyway, some time ago, a great white female shark was fished on the coast of Tunisia, and she was pregnant. And those animals reproduce at a very, very slow rate. And so to fish, you know what a great white looks like, right? That's the one in the movie Shark, right?
Yeah.
Jaw, thank you, Jaw, which I think celebrated some 50th anniversary recently. And so I think that there was an effort to use the anniversary to tell a different story.
Completely.
But to fish an animal like that, pregnant, that then is sold on the market for a very cheap price, because nobody really eats sharks, unless it's very poor people in some places. I could mention, coast of, Palestine, the coast of Tunisia, in some places in Morocco. And so I think this is a bit overlooked.
Yeah.
And the other one I would mention is maybe red coral, because red coral is interesting. It's very simple, but most of us are used to see red coral on jewels.
Yeah.
I don't know about Spain, but Italy, where I come from, it's a big market, red coral.
Yeah.
And most of the red coral that is left is in very deep places of the Mediterranean. There is very few left, but even so, we continue to harvest it, to fish it, if you like, to use it. But people often don't make the connection that that's a living animal that has an important issue, again, in the ecosystem, that takes centuries to grow.
Yeah.
And in 25, in the 21st century, that's what I wanted to say, I feel we could probably try to put two and two together a bit more and understand that there are some practices that we could probably live without.
Do without it. Going back to the responsibility of consumers or of educating. We also have the threat of climate change affecting it all. So I wonder, when you're thinking about these, regenerative practices, how do you manage planning for an ocean that is changing in large part because of this climate change? Temperature, acidification, how does one go about trying to affect change when what you're working on itself is an ever-moving goalpost?
It's a difficult question to answer.
Yeah.
I think, first of all, we live in an interesting time, right? With head of government saying that climate change doesn't exist. Fair enough. But I guess if we go that way, then we will see the consequences, right? Yeah. Anyhow. Of course, we've been talking about climate change for a long time, and the projections are very positive. And the Mediterranean is warming very quickly, much more quickly than other oceans, because it's small, right? And it's got quite a lot of warm waters, with few places where there's cold water that comes into the surface. So in some ways, we live in a place that has its own challenges. And as you probably all know, there is a connection between the ocean temperature and the weather events. And so we're starting to see more and more often storms. We coined the term that didn't exist some years ago, which is Medicane, which is the Mediterranean hurricane. And so we're starting to see more and more those sort of events, which we didn't have before. A lot of that is because the ocean is warmer. We try to build that into conservation strategies. So let me give you an example. With warm waters, some species will do better and some species will do worse. So subspecies, which are really important, again, for the ecosystem, but also for people, like anchovies and sardines, which are a big part of our diet, but also a big part of the diet of bluefin tunas, ache, and many other species, will probably tend to move away from certain areas. And so there is a shift in habitat or where species might be. So we try to think how those shifts will occur over time. There are a number of models that show us not only about how the ocean and the oceanographic features will change over time, but also how species will react. So there's two things that I could probably mention. One is, the anchovies and the sardines.
Yeah.
Now, the anchovies and the sardines are important because the anchovies and the sardines drive all the other fish because they are, at the bottom of the food chain. And so when we follow the anchovies and the sardines, all of the other fish, the most important fish in the Mediterranean is egg, right?
Yeah.
Cod, which is severely overfished, by the way. And it eats, anchovies and sardines. And so we try to build those shifts into management strategies, which management strategies means not only about how much we will fish in a certain place or a certain time, but also how we would put in place closures. So when we manage fisheries, we try to use both the fishing effort, which is measured in number of days at sea, with measures such as closing places during reproductive seasons, for example. And the other one I would mention is, of course, alien species. We now have, again, I was at a fisheries meeting last time, so I have a lot of those things in my head. We were talking about alien species, and alien species is blue crabs, which I assume everybody might have heard of, lionfish, rabbitfish, and a number of other species. It's interesting because it's become now a battle between those that want to eradicate alien species because they have an impact on the ecosystem, and those that are trying to create an economic opportunity out of them.
Actually, our last speaker was from Tunisia,
All
and
right.
he talked about how fishers... Yeah, exactly. Fishers used to hate them until they figured out that they can sell them, and now they're really keen on them. So exactly that.
Which is kind of a problem in the sense that I appreciate the economic opportunity, but also I appreciate the impact on the ecosystem. So these are the sort of situation with climate change we find ourselves in. And we're going to see more and more of that because the sea is going to continue to warm. The cities, we haven't talked much about sea level rise, but there is going to be a number of places in the Mediterranean that we'll probably see, especially where you have river deltas or a mix of fresh water and salt water. We'll start to see those impacts.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of that here in the south of Catalonia, in the region of Ebro already.
Venice.
Yeah, exactly. Venice.
Yeah.
Godspeed. I'm wondering, we talk a lot about the exceptionalism of Mediterranean and how unique it is for all its reasons, but I'm sure there's lessons from other regions that we can learn from, or the other way around. So I wonder if there's anything that you think the Mediterranean can learn in terms of management or regeneration from other regions, be it the Pacific or other parts of the world.
Yeah, I mean, I've done a lot of work in the Pacific, which I consider myself fortunate because it's really an incredible place. I think what I've seen in countries like Ecuador, Colombia, Chile, actually, Panama, is they have been able to create a better understanding within their political system of the importance of the ocean. And so when you go to those conferences around the world, you see the president of Chile or the presidents of certain places like Palau or Vanuatu or some of the small island states, which for better or worse, they're a lot more on the front lines because they live off the ocean and they are, in some ways the most concerned with things like climate change we were just talking about. And so sometimes I am perhaps a little bit frustrated, to be frank, that when we bring this home, we haven't been able to convince our politicians enough that investing in the ocean is a good thing. And so I find that the Mediterranean still has a lot to show for. We have a long tradition of using the ocean. We have been able to find solutions. I think in some ways, multilateral cooperation in the Mediterranean still works fairly well. I mean, considering a region that has so many challenges, but also so many disputes at sea, because there's many places in the Mediterranean which have, disputes, including some of the Greek islands between Greece and Turkey, including some of the borders at sea, between Italy and Tunisia, and so on and so forth. But what I want to say is I feel that if we were able to create a new generation of politicians, as some of the countries in South America have done, that understands the importance of the ocean, I think we would probably be able to do better. Yeah. We talk so much about one of the global targets the country signed on to is to protect at least 30% of the land and the sea by 2030. This was a target that was signed on to a few years ago in Montreal as part of the Convention for Biological Diversity. Now, without boring you too much with the details, it's a global target. So all of the countries should be protecting 30% of the land and the sea. Now, in the Mediterranean, we're less than 10% protected. And most of that 10% is distributed between France, Italy, and Spain, with some bits and pieces in other places. So it's not even representative across the region. When you go to the South Pacific coastline, so let's say between Central America, so Mexico, Panama, all the way down to Chile, most of those countries have already protected more than 30% of their waters. In some cases, like Panama, they've already protected 54% of their waters. Now, you can argue that Panama is a small country, but you could also argue that Croatia and Albania are small countries.
Yeah.
So I think the political leadership in those places has certainly had a benefit. And I also think that that political leadership has brought funding with it. And so when the funding comes in, then you're able to advance conservation a bit faster. So we're in a phase that we're still trying to sort of break through that political approach that it's not so much, what I want to say, progressive on protecting the sea. I think we're still fighting against a number of economic interests. But I think we're coming up against the threshold. I think that the change in the sea is so severe that the shift is going to have to happen. And in certain sectors like fisheries has happened, again, because it's happened by necessity, which is sad. It would have been better if it happened with a more strategic sort of perspective, longer-term perspective of the fishers. Unfortunately, we're humans. We tend to see sort of short terms a little bit. It has happened when the fishers didn't have any more fish to fish. And so they came and said, okay, now we understand. Now we have to do something.
Yeah, it's happening with tourism, even in Catalonia, right? People saying, oh, no, we need beaches, because they didn't listen to scientists when they talked about erosion and all these things. And now, like, where will the tourists go? I wondered, you actually spoke already about this décalage where, like, there's not a ton of marine protected areas, at least, written as such in, let's say, North Africa compared to, like, the north of the Mediterranean basin. And even in the places where those marine protected areas exist, there's this very real tension between economic development and environmental protection. So I wonder, how do you navigate this? And in those trade-offs, have you come across, we've talked about fisheries a bit, but like, have you come across examples of being able to convince local populations that ocean protection is in fact useful to their economic development, if not in the short term?
Again, it's
difficult.
It's difficult. I think the best way is to demonstrate the burden of proof, to demonstrate that this can be done. And so there's a number of places in the Mediterranean which have become models for other places in the world, and certainly in the Mediterranean. So one of the things we have done is to take people or take fishing communities from places like Gokova Bay in Turkey, or the Balearic Island to some extent, Medes Islands, or Portcro in France, or other places in Italy, in Croatia, that have created good models where MPAs have produced benefits for the environment and for people. And we have facilitated exchanges with other parts of the world. And so that, it's taken time. I'm not a very patient person, so I tend to want to see change a little bit quickly. But when I started to work at WWF in 2011, we had a big program that literally created exchanges among communities in different parts of the Mediterranean. And that was the beginning of that work. And it was good, but it wasn't generating results.
Yeah.
And now, 15 years later, I see, Morocco recently called me and said, can you help us organize an exchange with Turkey? We want to see how they have done it, how the fishers have become their own stewards of the environment. They finally have fish to fish. They've generated a healthy MPAs, which brings in funding, brings in interest, brings in economic revenues. Gokova Bay is a fairly touristic place in the south coast of Turkey. So I think generating those models is the best way. Again, it doesn't generate change fast. But again, I mean, I was at a meeting with the Minister of Environment a couple of weeks ago, and it's interesting when you have those exchanges because you understand their reality as well. We have these ideas that what are these people actually doing? They should be advancing much more quickly, but they're not. And they were talking about some of the budget cuts, and they were talking about some of the influence from other sectors. They were talking about interministerial coordination. So you understand actually how difficult it is to move institutions like ministries to advance. And if we take the example of Spain, I mean, Spain has had a number of projects, one of those called Intermares, which was funded by the European Union, which has been going on for quite some time, almost 10 years. And that project created all of the scientific baseline and stakeholder engagement for Spain to create new MPAs. And it took 10 years, but finally Spain is slowly, including a few weeks ago, declaring new marine parks. So it's the gestation time is very long.
Yeah.
But I think that progress is slowly happening as well.
Yeah. And I wonder, you spoke about the importance of, for example, fishers hearing from other fishers and, sharing perspectives from same communities of practice or similar communities of practice. But I wonder how so much of your work is also bringing people together from different worlds, the politicians with the scientists or the scientists with the communities. And what do you see as the biggest obstacle to this kind of like collaboration through silos, and how do you go about bridging? I know I'm basically asking you, why is your job so hard all the time? But in this aspect, how do you go about bridging these divides?
Let me start with the positives.
Yes.
For once.
Please.
I think that ocean has become much more present in the global agenda in general. As you might know this week, there is the climate COP, where countries meet in Brazil to discuss, how we advance towards some of the targets that have been set. And 20 years ago, we used to go to those conferences. There were almost no politicians, unless those that were, involved in some of those negotiations. There were almost no industries. There was almost no financial actors, banks, insurance companies, investment funds. So now all of those people go to those conferences. Now, again, that doesn't generate change at the pace we want, but at least those places, those platforms, those opportunities for people to exchange across different sectors now exist. So that's a big thing. And so we talk a lot about blue economy, sustainable blue economy. And so the interest in the ocean as an economic driver has certainly grown. And so there's a number of financial actors that are much more interested in investing in the ocean as an opportunity. The challenge is when this comes at a more specific level, in the sense that at a high level, we can all meet and talk. Now, how does that create change? And so when you want to bring a different sector, let me give you an example. I'm currently working on creating a large marine area in the Strait of Sicily between Italy, Tunisia, and Malta. Now, again, that's probably one of the busiest areas in the Mediterranean because the majority of the maritime traffic goes through there. There is a number of concessions that Italy has given for offshore wind development. There is already some MPAs, islands, lots of fishing, of course, is one of the most productive areas of the Mediterranean. And so it's not easy to have all of those sectors sitting at the table. And so a lot of the work is us, civil society, trying to create those connections and slowly bringing them to a point where there is a conversation. So what we do often is to create the opportunity to present a project, collect feedback, and then slowly bring that feedback to different actors. It takes a lot of time, but there is no place where different actors actually sit at the table. And so we have to create those opportunities beyond those conferences and those global agreements. I recently worked on a project that was intended to start thinking about foreseeable and positive futures for the region, meaning what future can we imagine for the region, and can we come together across sectors to imagine that future together? We didn't go very far because it was very challenging. We actually almost dropped the project because we weren't able to, while we could get answers from the NGOs, to some extent we could get answers from the governments, to some extent we could get answers from the fishing sector because we have good connection. It was very difficult to get answers from the tourism industry. It was very difficult to get answers from the shipping industry because the culture of working together is not there.
No.
But we have to be able to force and create that culture. Ultimately, we'll have to, there's no other option.
Yeah, there's no choice but together. I would love to go back to these positive futures, but if I may ask one last negative question. As you mentioned, the Mediterranean is, politically complex, and also in the last few years we have seen, major geopolitical shifts globally, as you said, with, a lot of politicians now denying basic science, but also in Europe specifically, or around the Mediterranean with things as serious as obvious conflict. And so I wonder, how do you navigate these collaborative frameworks when the chessboard of policies is shifting so quickly, and anything that you've noticed recently that has become harder or that you've had to adapt to?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about my experience. It's obviously very difficult, and NGOs are always very reluctant to get involved in some of the more complex or challenging issues. You can imagine we've been working in a region where migration was sort of the headline news for the last, 10, 15 years at least. And so environment doesn't always seem relevant, but at the same time it is. And so I'll say two things that I've worked on more recently. One is, in that complex scenario, there are always opportunities. And so maybe short term, we try to pick the opportunities that are there without, and sometimes those opportunities bring small success, but even small success in a very complex moment is enough. So otherwise we would have to stop working and not do anything. And so I have more recently worked with Morocco because they have been a champion in wanting to do more ocean protection. And so you try to stay away from some of the multilateral complex conversation, or try to stay away from places where there are heated disputes, and you try to work with countries that are more willing. The other example is to try and bring a different narrative. And I'll use, again, the example of the Strait of Sicily, because it's very sort of current. As you know, Italy and Tunisia have been a conversation about migrations and financial aid. Tunisia has asked for a loan from the IMF, and Italy has helped to negotiate that. So you can imagine that the two countries are negotiating some pretty important and crucial things. And at the same time, the Sicilian fishers are at war with the Tunisian fishers, because in Europe we have better regulation, and so they cannot fish certain things, and the Tunisians don't. And so they can fish while the Italians are not fishing. So in that complexity, where the fishers were, fighting with each other, and the two countries were negotiating some very complex issues, why would we be talking about a marine park, right? It seems ridiculous. But instead, we try to bring that project to the authorities with the idea that opportunity will provide a different lens, will provide a different narrative, so that while the countries are negotiating complex issues, they could also be cooperating on things that were not so difficult. And we've had mild success. I mean, it's been difficult, again, because the tensions are there, and often the narrative is that it's very difficult to overcome the political context in certain countries. I haven't been very politically correct, I know that, but I'm actually talking about the reality.
Yeah.
And so you speak with NGOs and you speak with donors, and I find that there's a lot of pessimistic views. But at the same time, I think we have to keep going because, I mean, the ocean in the end provides for us. And I think in some ways, again, like I said, I repeat myself, but in that context, you can find ways to break through. And now we're bringing the countries in next month, we're bringing the countries around the table to talk about a potential area to protect together. Now, it might take 10 years, but it's a success given that on other tables they are,
And otherwise, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you already assume that there's no point in talking or that negotiations are not possible, then therefore you're making them impossible. So there's absolute value to kind of denying the pessimism in that sense. And speaking of negotiations, as you mentioned, COP starts today in Belém, in Brazil. And the ocean, as you were saying, is going up the agenda compared to to previous like multilateral meetings. So I'm wondering, what should we keep an eye out, and what should we be advocating for at COP? What can this particular arena offer that then will downstream affect the Mediterranean specifically?
I've written some notes, but I think I have said most of the things. So this is an interesting COP. I think I've said that already. The positives and the negatives, because you'll have Brazil that just launched a $25 billion facility to protect the Amazon forest, which is a great win if you think about it, considering some governments ago wanted to cut the trees down. And at the same time, you have, US and China didn't show up. Last week, COP starts today, but the political segment was last week. And so we're already seeing some of the signs. I think that a couple of things. Again, ocean is important. For a long time, we've been advocating for the importance of the ocean in the climate negotiation, because the Paris Agreement has, in some ways, completely overshadowed the work in the ocean. Doesn't really bring the ocean as an element that will help us deliver on the Paris Agreement. But at the same time, some of the work in the ocean can help us adjust towards the potential 1.5-degree target, which is starting to slip away pretty quickly, right? And so I think the Mediterranean has a couple of things. One, the multilateralism, in the complexity of the current multilateralism, right? We talk so much about the UN and the role of the UN, and I think that the cooperation in the Mediterranean, in a region that is so divided, is still pretty good. And so I think that we could certainly show the example of how do we work together when you have an ocean that is shared, that is important to us. 150 million people live on the Mediterranean coastline, and 150 million plus people are going to be feeling the impacts. I mean, a lot of the cities in places like Israel, but south coast of Spain, they take fresh water from the sea. So even the most basic needs we have come from the sea. So it's a long shot. I'm not sure what your question.
If there's something we should be pushing for specifically at COP that would help the Mediterranean in terms of,
I think in general, continuing to believe that we need change at the pace that the scientists tell us we need is already a lot. There is quite a lot of skepticism. People feel powerless because it's hard to do something as an individual to impact the climate. And to some extent, climate change is, pretty daunting issue. But I think that continuing to understand how we can make small changes and how also the role of the ocean plays a part in climate change is important. I think paying attention on what emerges out of those meetings is always important. I know that as citizens, we tend to be a bit removed from some of those things, but they matter to us. And I think the more we can help people understand why they matter to us, the more the issues stay relevant on the political agenda. That would be my thinking.
Yeah, that's perfect. That leads me to our last question before we open questions to the public. Així que si algú té preguntes ja podeu anar pensant. Which is precisely, all of this can be really daunting, and as we mentioned, it's very complex and difficult. So if people in the public right now are wondering what can they do as consumers, as citizens who may not be actively working for nonprofits, what is your advice when people say, okay, I hear you, the ocean is important, now what do I do?
Yeah, first of all, it's very difficult to give advice. I mean, I can only share some of the things that I think about. Earlier I was talking about a new term, which is Medicaid. There's another term that we've recently also created, which is environmental anxiety. So a lot of people, because there's so much information and so much bad news, people are starting to really feel what that is. I think I would start with saying one of the great things about this century is access to information. We often talk about the negatives of too much information, the misuse of social media, but actually we're able to know much more and to understand much more about what happens in the world through information. And so I think being aware is already a lot, because a lot of people either don't care, or they don't want to be aware, or they don't want to believe that some of those changes that are happening around us are true. And so I think being aware is important. Now, between being aware and being able to create change, there's still a huge gap. But again, I think information is key. And I think we often, as consumers, don't realize the power that we have. Let me give maybe one example.
Yeah.
I've worked quite a bit with the tuna industry, not the bluefin tuna, but the tuna that is in the cans. The bluefin tuna doesn't end up in the cans. The meat is too good to end up in the cans. And we've been doing a lot of work with some of the companies to be able to not only improve the product in the sense that the fish would be more sustainable, but also try to help consumers choose. What is incredible is that the tuna is one of the cheapest sources of protein that you can find on a supermarket shelf. And yet, we're fishing it out of the water. It's not a renewable source. It's not like cows. You can always breed more cows, but you can't breed more tunas. And so we've been trying to change that misconception that tuna is cheap protein.
Yeah.
But tuna is actually not only important protein, but also comes at a very heavy, environmental cost. And we've done a lot of work with consumers to try to influence how they would choose or change their behavior in buying tuna. But small things like that actually make a huge difference, because by influencing consumers in certain countries, we've been able to convince the company to stop sourcing tuna that was not sustainable, in the sense that people were asking for sustainable products. Sustainable products used a label that consumers recognized. And that label called for sustainable products, means the company had to stop fishing yellowfin out of the Indian Ocean because it was so depleted, and they start fishing, skipjack out of the Atlantic Ocean. So you can make that difference simply by buying tuna. That's what I'm trying to say. And we could do it on a much bigger scale. Now, this is my own perception. My perception is that we often feel very powerless because the industry tells us what to do. They tell us what to buy. They set the price. They show us on TV what they should be buying and why. And so I feel that creating change, or to being responsible consumers, which we talk so much about, it takes a huge act of, proactiveness from individuals, because we are used to do the same things over and over again. And at the end of a busy day at work, or people that have children in school and have full-time jobs, in the end they have to put something on the table at the end of the day. And it's easy to buy stuff off the supermarket, whether it's meat or tuna or vegetables. But shifting the way we think and the way we consume will create a change, but it's an active change.
Yeah.
It's not going to come because we're going to change the products in the supermarket. it's going to come because people are willing to get out of their habits.
Yeah.
I mean, Spain, I don't mean to be criticizing, but again, the average person in Spain eats quite a lot of fish.
We do.
And so,
Us and the Japanese, just.
yeah, and
Yeah.
so unfortunately, that will have to decrease if you want to eat good products that are more sustainable. We will all have to eat a bit less and buy better. Now, that's also a bit naive because often we buy with money, right? We pay. We live in a society where people buy what they can afford, and so often consumers that are able to make a choice are consumers that have better income, and that's unfair. I recognize that, and so we also try to bring products or practices that will be able to help communities or people that don't have the same level of incomes. Now, that's easier on the coastline, that's easier in places where we can work with communities to shift the way they access resources. It's harder to do in big cities where people buy from the supermarket. Obviously, it's the proximity to the produce is further in big cities, so it's harder to control the access and the opportunity. So I think that there's small things. I think we covered quite a lot of ground in terms of the fish being overfished, the sharks. I mean, that's another thing. A lot of people don't know that their kids eat shark in school because shark is not very good. And so when they fish sharks, what they do is they make nuggets, which are either chicken or shark, and they serve it in school canteens because it's white meat, doesn't taste much, and the kids are okay with it. But can you imagine that we actually have to fish sharks to feed kids in school? It makes absolutely no sense.
Yeah.
And that meat is cheap, again, and the impact on the ecosystem is huge.
Yeah, they have found it in a lot of fish and chips in the UK too.
Yeah.
Because if you batter and fry it,
You can eat anything.
you can eat anything.
So, I mean, it's a very complex issue.
Yeah.
But I think that there are ways, and if we all want to create change, I think we have access to information to how we can do it. I guess that's what I want to say.
Information is not
When
a
I was a
bottleneck.
kid, honestly, I didn't remember my parents understanding what we were eating rather than getting eggs from the local producer. But other than that, we were going to the fish market and buying fish. Now you can go to the fish market. I tell you this and then I stop. My mom every once in a while calls me and I said, "Oh, I bought calamari from FAO." You know, the fish products that are labeled by the FAO fishing zone. I don't know if you've ever seen that. "Oh, I bought squid from FAO fishing zone 16." I'm like, "What does that mean?" I was like, "Well, it means that you shouldn't buy it." That's what it means. Because when you go and look, that's actually squid fish out of Vietnam or any place in the Indo-Pacific area, which is generally not very good. I mean, it's either overfished or it's farmed, and when you farm it, they put a lot of chemicals into it. But I guess what I'm trying to say is the information is there if you want to see
If
it.
you want to see it.
Now, it's hard, I understand. We go to the supermarket at 7 p.m. running, and we get the things that we know. But the information is there if we want to see.
Yeah, nothing changes if we don't change. And speaking of access to information, you have a world-class expert on stage and time for questions. So does anyone have any question whatsoever for our speaker? Pregunta A. I think there's a mic on its way. Oh, we have two. Okay, maybe we start with the gentleman.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your explanation. You mentioned COP30, actually. That permit me that I'm skeptic about the COP. If you see a lot of people are going there, emit a lot of CO2 to get there and to come back, make a lot of promises, and when they are back, when you see all the COPs, a few % are accomplished because there's no obligation. when you mention, to come back to the Mediterranean, when you have these conferences with the different countries, is there a political will to accomplish the agreements, and can we create tools to obligate them to accomplish?
It's a very good question. Let me start with the first part, because all of those people that you see at COPs, I'm one of those. So I am guilty, and it is true that we often talk about that. We often talk about, we go to those conferences, the cost of those conferences is huge. They do it sometimes in places like Belém, which is a very small town. So I'm sure the town is upside down. I went to a COP in Colombia, in Cali, Colombia last year, and the city was completely belly up because there were 20,000 people talking about biodiversity. So that's a problem, but at the same time, it's a place where people can meet and can exchange, going back to silos. And I think that we've seen a shift where you have many more ministers, many more heads of states being present at those conferences, which is a positive sign. Now, it doesn't necessarily create change. And then to the second part, we have quite a number of obligations in place. I would argue that the issue is not the regulations. I would argue that the issue is implementation and compliance with regulations. And so we now live in a time, Europe in particular, other places a bit less, where we are very regulated. Everything we do in the sea and to some extent on land is very well regulated, including climate, because there are targets as part of the Paris Agreement that are in place that are not voluntary but binding for the countries. And, you know, we're trying to do some things. Europe is trying to get rid of diesel engines. And some work that I'm doing that I didn't talk about is to try and stop fishermen from using diesel engines and to switch to electric hybrid engines. We also have to understand that there's no perfect solution, because when you talk about hybrid engines, people start talking about batteries and lithium and all of those things. Nothing is going to be net zero. That's the problem. We're always going to have some impact. No, either we take the humans out of the earth, or we're going to have to leave some, some damage behind. So I think that tools are there. I think the solutions are there. I think that binding targets are largely there. I was talking about the 30% target, which is a binding target as part of the Convention for Biological Diversity. In recent times, the UN approved a new treaty which will allow to protect the high seas. The high seas is the part of the sea outside the waters that each nation can claim. So we have infrastructure in place. The question is the political willingness to move it fast enough into implementation. Now, in Europe, we have infraction procedures, which are okay in the sense that when countries don't comply with certain regulations, like water pollution on the coastline through the Water Framework Directive is an example, and some countries get an infraction procedure. The problem is that the infraction procedure is often dealt with a fine or with some sort of plan that then doesn't result into anything. So again, I think the answer to the question is being able to create the change through the political system, because ultimately, either we live in a place where power is deregulated, in the east coast of Africa, communities can protect their own territory. In Europe, we cannot do that. There is no territorial rights. And so we'll have to work through the political system and the institutional system, which is very slow. But to answer your question, again, I think you have, despite the frustration for the meetings, which I agree with you, I think it's a very good point. I think we have the tools and we have the regulations. The point is to put them in practice quickly enough. But often those regulations and those conversations remain in very specific environments, right? In very specific bubbles. us NGO talk to the government about doing better. But the citizens mostly don't know what's going on. And who's going to read an article about the failures of COP? I mean, I appreciate that you do, but I suppose that not very many people will read that. But it is important for them, and that's why I was advocating for information. And on the good note, there's a lot of young people that, speaking about the Sustainable Ocean Lines, there's a lot of young people that have become ocean advocates because they understand that their generation is probably the one that is going to be the biggest change, and probably the one that is going to be left to deal with some of the mess we made and our parents made and so on and so forth. And so I think in some ways the young movement to protect the environment is, I see it growing compared to my own generation, that we got there a bit late. So that gives me a bit of hope, because I feel that the young generation is a bit divided between complete carelessness, and interest. And so hopefully there will be some change generated through those that care.
And if I may, I think it relates to what you were saying earlier about, believing that cooperation is possible, even if right now in geopolitical context, sometimes people feel really negative. I think it's similar when it comes to political will. We tend to disengage from politics because politics doesn't work. But if we are the lucky ones in democracies, the more we disengage, the less it works. And because it doesn't work, then we disengage. And so there needs to be, I think, a certain, because I'm a political scientist by training, a certain realization that we do have power, and that when you look at, for example, the prioritization of plastics, as you were saying, there is more political mandate for it because more people care about it. And we get to choose what we care about, I mean, not the only reason, but there's been like a lot of public awareness campaigns about these issues that have worked, and we're seeing it with things like deep seabed mining and other issues. So, it's definitely not easy, but I think there's something about political mandate that we need to realize is in our hands as citizens and voters and folks who are lucky enough to live in democracy.
I don't know if I'm allowed to ask a question back, but one thing that shocks me in my own country, with this government, but any other government before, I don't hear often about them talking about the environment or any that they have done about the environment. Or they go to those COPs, as you say, or those ocean events. What do they bring back to their constituencies? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. In some ways, I appreciate more President Boric of Chile, who's been a champion for a number of ocean issues, who not only speaks at those conferences, but also has protected, a good portion of his own, of his own ocean. But my question back is, how often do you hear your governments talk about environment? Or do you read it in the news? Almost never, right? Which means we're not given anything and we're not asking anything, because it's not a topic of conversation in the news. Or I find it incredible. And so I'm somebody who, and I'm saying openly, I haven't voted for any of the governments in Italy over the past at least 10 years, and the year before then I lived in another country, so probably 20 years. But I talk to the government all the time because I still need to work with them to move the needle. So, but that's me as a sort of as a marine expert. We need citizens to pay more attention, and it's very, very difficult.
Yeah. But you're here, so go tell the rest. Sorry, tenim una altra pregunta.
Thank you for sharing your experience. Well, my question is a bit more technical, not so political. It seems that in order to reach the decarbonization goals, the shipping companies are keen on switching from fuel to ammonia. What do you think, as marine conservationists, what do you think of this idea?
I must admit, I'm not a shipping expert. The only thing I know is that the Mediterranean, and I wanted to bring as an example before, has actually created a sulfur control area a regional scale, so because of shipping. So there are initiatives to control the pollution from the shipping industry because it's becoming significant, and the cruise industry continues to grow. I've done a little bit of work with the cruise industry, but more on their pollution, not emissions, but pollution and food waste side. And there are some companies that, despite everything we can say about cruise industry, they try to have much more sustainable practices, at least in terms of food waste, in terms of recycling on board, and so on and so forth. I'm not an expert in ammonia, and so I'm not sure.
The problem is, as you can see, the problem is ammonia is a very big water polluter, much more than fuel, because if you have a ship wreckage, you can contain in some ways the pollution. But thank you. But if it is ammonia, and there is no way to stop the spreading of this hazardous chemical, which is ammonia, which kills everything in maybe miles.
It's toxic.
From the shipping wreck. And I haven't read anything in the press or yes, in the press about this potential problem, as I see it. Maybe it's not such a big problem, but if you think that a cargo may contain thousands of liters of ammonia, concentrated ammonia, I see it as a very big potential problem.
I mean, all the emission from shipping is pretty significant. Now, there's a number of filters that have been applied to reduce emission into the atmosphere, but of course they collect chemicals that then need to be disposed. That's the problem. Going back to the question of the hybrid batteries, everything has a cost. Now, I don't know about ammonia. I know ammonia would kill everything in the ocean, apart from creating more ocean acidification and so on and so forth. So I appreciate that. That's a different story. But I think there is a realization that with the shipping industry increasing, because the movement of goods globally is increasing, and what is also incredible is that the manufacturing of parts is so divided across the world that it's all moved by ship. And so I think there's a lot of attention on the emissions, but I never heard about the ammonia. It's the first time I...
Yeah, this is because we are trying to solve a problem, a very big problem, which is climate change, but we can make some other big problems as well, and especially in the ocean, and in a semi-closed sea like the Mediterranean. I think it will be catastrophic if there is a very big ship wreckage with ammonia.
Okay.
But that's just an opinion. I haven't read any study about it.
I know, just because we're in Barcelona, the World Ocean Council, that is now based out of Barcelona, and other organizations in the Med have created this Green Med program to look particularly at how to make shipping more green. I know they did an event a few months back in Barcelona to announce it, and there's a lot of research going into it. So I think if you want to look at like what the shipping industry is, trying to figure out together, I think that may be a good resource. But I think it's a really good point that most of our problems today used to be yesterday's solutions. Carbon emissions back in the day, like gas was phenomenal, and we used to kill whales to light lamps, and now now Moby Dick is history, but now we have climate change. So I think an environmental communication is always a useful thing to think, is the solution that we're presenting potentially going to be tomorrow's problem? I think we have maybe time for one last quick question. Yeah, we have. Some of it? No? I guess I will ask it, which is, you discussed about this event that you had to try to discuss a positive future, what that would look like. What does that look like for you? If we project ourselves, to end on a sweet note, 10 years forward, what does a healthy, sustainable Mediterranean look like to you? What's your vision?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I feel that when we talk about that, we tend to perhaps be a bit naive in the way we want to describe a positive future. But I think that the best we can really do is to try to find a balance between continuing to use the sea, because we need to use the sea, whether it's fish or water or something else, but perhaps come to compromise so that we could find a balance between protecting the resources and using the resources. One thing I wanted to mention, and I didn't, is there was a ocean conference this year in France in June, and civil society got together with academia and put together a declaration, which is called One Sea, One Future, where we call for a number of things that we would like to see, for the Mediterranean. And I think we talked about two things. I contributed to writing that. One is a sea that is a success story, not a failure. A sea that continues to be prosperous. A sea that brings peace, which is a strong word, but frankly, is a word that we need in the context we live in. Yeah. And then a peace where, again, I think resources, at least the most important resources, do better than they do today. So I think we can imagine that by 2050, if we were to keep up with some of the regulations that we have in place, and we're able to be a bit more ambitious and spend money more wisely, so perhaps instead of increasing defense spending, we're going to spend a little bit more in better things. And we are the ones that, we didn't talk about that, but we are the ones that elect the European Parliament, right? So, and they're the ones that decide about this kind of stuff. So I think that we could get there. I don't think that's as impossible as people think it is. It takes work. Some sectors will suffer. Some type of fisheries will disappear, unfortunately. Some tourists won't thrive just as much. But I think it's all stuff we can live with. It's about economic profitability against, survival. So people will have to make a decision. Yeah. And next generation will have some tough choices to make.
Let's pick survival. Call me brave. Thank you so much.
Be very happy to share the declaration with people. I don't know if there's a way, but
yes,
it's an interesting piece which was difficult to write because people were careful with words, but in the end it came together nicely.
Yeah, it's almost Christmas, so it can be our wish list.
Yeah.
Just a reminder, this has been recorded and will be in YouTube in case you want to share with any friends, but we can maybe add some of the notes there for people to find them. Thank you again so much for your time. Thank you again so much for your wisdom.
Thank you. Wisdom. It was great to thank you.
Gracias por acompañarnos. Esperamos que hayan disfrutado de la sesión. Recuerden devolver a la salida el aparato facilitado para l'activitat. Gràcies per su col·laboració. Gràcies per acompanyar-nos. Esperem que hagin gaudit de la sessió. Recordin retornar a la sortida l'aparell facilitat per a l'activitat. Gràcies per la seva col·laboració. Thank you for joining us. We hope you have enjoyed the show. Please, remember to return the device provided for the activity at the exit. Thank you for your collaboration.